for our eyes. The abuse continues, and it has been used every single time that people who spoke up to criticize, to assert our right to freedom, this has been suppressed. Given this context, I think it's very important that we have coming together, again, a strategic opportunity to conduct a forum, a webinar on the rising repression of our basic rights during this pandemic. Aside from sustaining and increasing the interest of the public on this discussion of a lawfare, I think it's important that we determine how we can effectively unite and respond to it in order to ensure the survival of our democratic rights and freedoms across future generations. Today, we welcome all of you who are here listening to us through your gadgets, which is our normal these days, and to a morning of intellectual discourse that will hopefully bring us very difficult truths, but truths that we have to collectively face, survive, and overcome. But I hope that this morning will also spark a flame in all our hearts that will empower us so that we can rise against those who inflict this on persons, organizations, and institutions who are fighting for our liberties, for our freedom, and for our democratic rights.
Without further ado, to give us a background of today's discussion and what to expect in our very interesting webinar, let me acknowledge one of the founding members of the Committee for the Freedom of Senator Laila de Lima. She is a Filipino broadcaster, host, economist, and columnist popularly known as Maring Winnie. She was the 5th Director General of the National Economic and Development Authority and holds the rank of Professor Emeritus at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. Let us all welcome Professor Solita Winnie C. Monson.
Good morning. On behalf of the Committee for the Freedom of Laila M. de Lima, we welcome you to the webinar on lawfare. We have a sexy topic, clampdown in the face of lockdown. It is a timely subject, as Dean Dinky has said, but I thought I would start the ball rolling by sharing with you some indicators of the state of our justice system as recorded by the Philippine Statistics Authority, StatDev 2019, which monitors this administration's Philippine Development Plan. Let me start. The percentile rank in the World Governance Indicators Rule of Law improved. I mean, that's the target. We will improve our percentile rank. Our baseline was 42.31. That means we were on the 42nd percentile. And our target for 2022 was 50. What does our latest data show? According to the StatDev, we regressed. Instead of going up, we went down. We are now in the 34th percentile. Next, percentile rank in the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. Fundamental rights improved. We wanted to go to 29th percentile because our baseline in 2015 was 26.55. We were in the 26th percentile. What does our 2019 data show? According to the StatDev, we regressed again to 16.67. Next, our percentile rank in the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index Civil Justice Indicator. We wanted to improve it. From 23rd percentile, we wanted to go to the 27th percentile. Medyo mababa ang kaligayahan natin. Ano ang nangyari sa atin? Well, we regressed again. Our latest data shows that instead of being in the 23rd percentile, we are now in the 21st percentile. Next, percentile rank in the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index, Criminal Justice Indicator. We started out at 25th percentile. We wanted to go to the 29th percentile. At the end of 2019, we were at the 10th percentile. You can see a constant regression of our indices of rule of law and justice. This is all in the Philippine Statistics Agency's website. Under StatDev 2019, I invite you to see how we have regressed. after the most conspicuous victim of this constant regression, of course, is our Senator Laila M. de Lima, who is celebrating her 61st birthday on August 27, her 4th year celebrating her birthday in detention. That's the most conspicuous, most well-known victims. And what has happened, as shown by these indicators, is that the rule of law has slowly been strangled and starved to death until it is now the rule by law. What do I mean by that? Rule of law, you strangle it, you remove the values, you remove the basic human values and the system of checks and balances, and what you get? It's the rule by law. And what is lawfare? Well, it is the use of law, is it not, as a weapon? As we use, if it is the rule of law that is used as lawfare as a weapon, then we get the arbitral case we filed with regard to the West Philippine Sea, when all attempts at diplomacy and negotiations failed. Rule of law, lawfare, can be a godsend if it is based on the rule of law. But if it is the rule by law that is used as a weapon, as we have seen, used against Senator De Lima, Chief Justice Sereno, Patricia Fox, Maria Ressa, now that becomes not a godsend, but a devil send. All right? So that in this pandemic, as was indicated by Dinky, we have seen increasing examples of ordinary people. And of late, of course, we have a perfect example of rule by law, the new Anti-Terrorism Act, unless it is declared, of course, unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the face of 29 challenges to its validity. We are still fighting. So today we have a very distinguished group of panelists led by Professor Teddy Te. I don't see him, but I saw him earlier. Professor Teddy Te, who is going to be our lecturer, and his lecture will be commented on by Attorney Emerlyn Hill, who is a senior legal advisor of the International Commission of Jurists. And we have Dr. Gideon Lasco, who I think is my boss. I'm not sure. Columnist. He is a columnist in the Philippine Daily Inquirer. And finally, Mr. Jules Giang, who is founder of the National Alliance of Youth Leaders. Thank God we have some youth, because we are all so old. And talagang nahihimatay na tayo dito. We have somebody new coming on. And of course, we have our moderators, Dinky and Jesus, nakalimutan ko na. Senior moment. Anyway, thank you very much, and let the warfare begin, the lawfare begin.
Thank you very much, Prof. Winnie. Dino po, ma'am. Now more than ever, bawal ang pasaway. At this juncture, we will now proceed to our main speaker. Our guest speaker needs no introduction. He is one of our country's foremost human rights lawyers and is an active pillar of the Free Legal Assistance Group, coming to the aid of indigent clients in their legal woes for 23 years. Born in Davao City, Davao po, he completed a degree in psychology from the University of the Philippines and proceeded to also complete his law studies in the same university. He finished his law degree as one of the top 20 of their class and was awarded the Gonzalo Gonzalez Most Outstanding Law Intern Award. Upon passing the bar in 1990, he volunteered as a lawyer for the Free Legal Assistance Group, even as he was practicing at a private firm in Makati. A Master's of Law degree holder from Columbia Law School, he also served as the Vice President for Legal Affairs of the University of the Philippines. He also argued on several cases of first impression before the Supreme Court, particularly the constitutionality of the death penalty, the Visiting Forces Agreement, the All Deregulation Law, among many other cases. In December 2014, he was appointed the spokesperson and chief of the Supreme Court Public Information Office by then Chief Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno. Presently, Prof. Te is a faculty member in the UP College of Law, DLSU College of Law, and Ateneo Law School. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome my mentor in the Free Legal Assistance Group, Attorney Theodore Te.
Thank you, Dino. Thank you, Sec Dinky. Thank you, Prof. Winnie. Good morning, everyone, and I'm very happy to be part of this webinar. Can you give me 20 seconds to just set up my slides? Something that's very necessary now because of all of this technology. And I hope you can see this. And so I wanted to start with just my operational definition of lawfare. I know that Prof. Winnie has already given us a very technical definition of lawfare as we understand it. And I totally agree with it. But I wanted to operationalize how I understood lawfare by simply saying that it is state violence in place of governance. And state violence, of course, is nothing new. We've heard of that through many, many regimes. And it is simply the use of state violence asserted against people, against Filipinos, in place of policy, in place of governance. But I wanted to start with a quote from Senator Jose Diokno. And interestingly enough, these words that Senator Diokno spoke were spoken in 1986, just a few months after the EDSA revolution that removed Marcos from power. And so I wanted to start with his words in a speech that he gave in May 1986. The rule of law is not perfect, yet it is another step to curb violence and should be used to the extent possible to contain oppression and to force prosecutors and judges and justices in a repressive regime to look at themselves squarely. But what if governments use force against us instead of for us? What if they use violence not as the last, but as the first and continuous resort? Can the rule of law then protect us? If not, can we meet violence with non-violence, or should we, in the phrase so popular today, meet force with force? In this excerpt, Senator Diokno Kapepe forces us, posts some uncomfortable questions just a few short months after a non-violent uprising that removed a dictator from power. Allow me to paraphrase these questions. What if governments use force against and not for the people? What if violence is used as a first and not as a last resort? And what is the use of law or rule of law in such a situation? I see my role this morning not as a lecturer, because I look at the panelists and I'm looking forward to listening to also their presentations. I see my role this morning as providing a sort of national situationer. Certainly not the only national situationer, because I know that, for example, Prof. Winnie had already given us a teaser of sorts. I know that Dean Tony at the end will probably also give us his take on what is happening in the national situation. But I wanted to provide a sort of national situationer to help us view, or provide the frame for us to view what is happening within this lockdown. I think we're going 150 plus days into this lockdown. And hopefully to provide a frame for which to view what's happening and maybe to suggest a few things, a few steps forward in the hope that we may emerge from this lockdown with body, mind, and soul and spirit intact. I view COVID-19 as something that took all of us by surprise. None of us were prepared for this, let alone government. And so we were all forced to adapt in many big and small ways. But I am reminded of these words from Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago and the former chief of staff of President Obama. Never let a crisis go to waste. And while he may have mentioned this in a hopeful manner, I would like to use this phrase as a way to describe how this government, took advantage of this crisis, and how this government didn't let this crisis go to waste in terms of how it affects civil liberties and fundamental freedoms. One of the striking things in this lockdown, in this clampdown that we are in, is really the opacity of information. Attorney Dino, one of our moderators, has gained popularity, well, if maybe not notoriety, for confronting, for bringing to the fore the issue of the health of the president. But that's not the only thing that's been opaque. There have been many things that have been opaque within this period of lockdown. There has been so much information that we desperately want to find out, but have not been able to find out. There has been much information that has not been very clear. In fact, have been very, very confusing, have been in fact disorienting. And so questions over data, questions over the science, questions over the approaches, the reasons for the approaches have not really been addressed. With the exception of a few, much of the communication by government spokespeople have not been found to be credible. And primarily because I think the communicators that they have used have been the same communicators for the president. And so with the exception of a few who are considered professionals and have conducted themselves professionally, really there is a need for more transparency in information. Certainly we are fighting against a common enemy, an enemy that does not distinguish as to political color, as to political ideology, and it is an enemy that is deadly. And so in the face of such an enemy, we need more transparency rather than opacity. But I think this is one distinguishing feature of this clampdown, that it is not just a clampdown on our freedoms, it is a clampdown on information as well. And so this opacity is probably one of the greatest stumbling blocks towards trying to find solutions in emerging from this clampdown, from this lockdown, with our liberties intact, with our freedoms enhanced, and with our body, mind, soul, and spirit thriving as well. Of course, this government took advantage of what was going on. Impunity has been there for some time. It wasn't invented by this government, but this government has, I think, taken impunity to levels unheard of. Impunity reigns when government is opaque, when there is no clear information source, when there's no clear information channel. And this opacity, of course, did not only extend to COVID-19 and governance measures, it extended also to other issues involving civil and political rights. There, of course, has been impunity in the way that this government has addressed dissent. This actual dissent in the form of organized assemblies or rallies, but also dissent by way of social media, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. The attacks against members of the media have continued. There have been, of course, critical pushback against governance, against government measures, not only in relation to addressing COVID, but also in relation to the clampdown on civil liberties and fundamental freedoms. And so we've heard and we know, of course, of the shutdown of ABS-CBN, the closure of ABS-CBN by the denial of franchise by a committee, basically just by a committee of Congress. And a few months ago, we never would have thought that would happen, but it has happened. Significantly, this period also saw government not only challenging critical press, but also its citizens. It has gone against ordinary citizens expressing their views on social media. And it's been aided not just by law enforcement, but by the law itself. Who can forget Section 6 of the Emergency Powers Law, which singles out use of social media that is critical to government as a crime, as a criminal offense. Well, that law has already lapsed, but again, that particular period is, I think, significant, and we must continue to point out that that particular period was a period wherein there was a specific law that directly criminalized expression that was critical against the government. Within this period, of course, we also saw law enforcement officials who were left as the guardians of permissible content. You had police officers arresting people without warrants for posting or for saying statements that were critical. Ronel Mas, a teacher who posted on his Facebook account, was arrested by the NBI, brought from his province to NBI, paraded like a notorious criminal, and then charged with an experimental theory. And the only way that government can see themselves doing that is because they know they can get away with it. And so that's impunity. He continues to reign because of, I think, the experiments that they are taking, and the experiments that have largely been left unaddressed or unchallenged, or in a sense untreated by the courts. The rule on warrantless arrest has been basically left to police to administer. And again, each police officer is left to his or her own devices in interpreting what the offense is. And if you have read Republic Act 11332, for example, the law on quarantine, on public health emergency, I think the lawyers here would have a debate among ourselves as to what effectively the acts that are criminalized are. Yet we allow police officers to look at something and say that is a crime and I can arrest that person. And so again, there is some degree of there is a lot of problems in terms of how the laws are used, how the laws are enforced, but also how the laws are written.
Prof. Te?
And of course, it did not help that the approach taken by government is yes.
We'll just cut you a little bit
Dino.
because some people can't hear the audio, so we will have to restream. So
right.
I will get back to you.
Okay. Should I stop sharing?
Apologies for that. Yeah. Okay. You may proceed again, Prof. Te. It's now streaming.
All right. Okay, just to pick it up. I was about to say that it did not help that the first and primary resort of government during this time was a law enforcement approach, not a medical or a public health approach. It viewed people who were violating its regulations and rules as a law and order problem. And so the first resort was to arrest. And of course, we know that in a situation where we are highly encouraged to be physically distant from each other, we know that the more arrests we make, the more problems we create for ourselves in terms of congestion of the jails and the detention centers. And so again, it did not help that an approach that was probably not very strategic, an approach that did not see the problem for what it was really contributed to the exacerbation of the problem or the crisis. Impunity also continued or was even heightened in terms of marginalizing those already marginalized. And in this respect, I would like to maybe cite as an example the continued militarization in Luma-run schools. In the early part of last year, we in the Free Legal Assistance Group filed a petition challenging the extension of martial law on behalf of a group of Lumad educators. And in that time, the militarization was already there, was already continuing. And yet, even during this time of lockdown, even during this time of public health emergency, that continued. Lumad schools were being closed. Lumad educators were being targeted and tagged. Militarization continued. And so, during this period, it was as if martial law had not been lifted and was still continuing. The lockdown, of course, and the limited ability of defenders, lawyers, and advocates to move freely, allowed the already marginalized to be even more marginalized. We had problems with processes, legal processes, because the legal processes were slow to adapt to what was going on. Technology was not immediately mainstreamed into the legal processes. And so we had a continuing series of warrantless arrests, which required people to be inquested, to post bail, but again, it took longer. The detention of people took longer because of the processes that were not immediately adopted from analog to digital. And so that continued, detention continued. Courts took longer in terms of resolving processes or cases because again, it took some time before we could adapt. And so because of that, minor offenses rather, resulted in people who were detained much longer than they should have been detained. It took longer to post bail, even for very, very minor offenses, simply because lawyers and advocates could not move around. Were there quick fixes that should have been put in place? Yes, there should have been quick fixes that should have been put in place. But again, at that point in time, no one apparently was in charge of putting in these quick fixes. And so we could say impunity continued. Of course, one thing that was very clear, red tagging, red baiting continued. It was aggressive, it was relentless, and while it started even before the pandemic and the lockdown, it continued during this lockdown. It was intensified, and the effects, of course, cannot be gainsaid. As with the rise in EJKs, the red tagging has resulted in more active surveillance, has resulted in attacks, has resulted in killings of many human rights advocates and defenders. The latest, of course, among them, Randy Echeniz, and of course, Zara Alvarez. And we must say something about the brazen way by which the police can just come into a funeral parlor and, over the objections of the family, take the remains of someone who has just been killed. Talk about violations of the right of a person to dignity, of the widowed to dignity, and the family to grieve. And so, of course, one of the stumbling blocks in this whole litany, and I could go on and on, but I will not for lack of time, is of course the absence of a meaningful remedy for many of these. For example, red tagging. I know that many of the advocates who have been red tagged, who have been painted in this way, have sought judicial relief. Unfortunately, the courts have been quite slow, if not ineffective, in addressing this particular policy or phenomenon. And here I'd like to cite a specific resolution of the Supreme Court. It is an unsigned resolution because it dismissed a petition simply because without a comment from the Solicitor General. This resolution was in the case of Zarate et al. Versus Aquino III. It was filed even before the term of the current president. But it is significant because in that particular petition that was filed, the petition cited the listing of advocates and defenders in an order of battle, and sought the writs of amparo and habeas data, which not so long ago were being touted as human rights writs and remedies, the last resort remedies or the last resort writs. Unfortunately, in that particular case, the court, through an unsigned resolution, but with a dissent, said that the writs of amparo and habeas data were unavailing because, as if I may cite the court, they were limited to actual threats, and being listed in the order of battle did not apparently constitute an actual threat. Of course, there are ways of relitigating that motion. Unfortunately, the context for relitigating that motion would need, apparently in the eyes of the court, an actual threat. So we have been and continue to be in a state of war. It's a war that's been waged against us by aggressive policies that have resulted in state violence against rights of the people. It's been a war against women, and of course, Senator Laila, still in jail on charges that are, to be very, very frank about it, flimsy, continues to be in jail. And I must also point out that she apparently is the only detainee to be accorded such high levels of security that you would see photos of her whenever she's traveling that that they can't even allow pictures to be taken of her. So clearly the war continues. It's a war against truth. The truth, I spoke earlier about opacity and the need for transparency. It's been a war against truth, and that war continues. It's a war against dissent. It's a war against freedoms. It's a war against the way of life that we understand it. It's a war against constitutionalism, in fact. And it's been a war against almost everything, except maybe against, aggressively against COVID. So we find ourselves in that state. And unfortunately, I'm about to end. What we are seeing now is also a constitution that is being stretched. It's an elastic constitution. It's being stretched by interpretations, by advocacies posed by government that that stretch provisions of the constitution that are intended to protect rights. It is stretched, for example, by policies such as a tokhang in the name of COVID-19, house-to-house searches, right? Warrantless arrests where police are asked to determine for themselves what constitutes a crime. Of course, it isn't helped that the balance of powers that is set by the constitutional architecture has really been upset now. We have a very strong and dominant executive branch. We have a captured Congress, and we have a court that is inscrutable. We have a court that does not say much, and does not say much very often. There have been cases filed before this court on many of the things that we have talked about: the closure of ABS-CBN, the passage of the Emergency Powers Law, and it has taken some time for the court to say something. And so, that is something that is, I think, for me as a lawyer, that is something, and as a legal academic as well, that is something that is quite distressing, because the greatest value of the court, in my opinion, is its predictability, not its inscrutability. The people should know where the court will land whenever a question or a challenge that is brought on the ground of rights is concerned. And it should land, as it has always said, in favor of rights. And people should be able to predict where the court will land. Unfortunately, now people keep asking, what will the court probably say? What will the court rule? Let's say in the case of, how will the court rule in the case of the terror law petitions that have been filed? I won't discuss much of that, again, for lack of time, because they're also pending, but maybe during the question and answer, we can talk about that. What we need right now probably is for the court to say something more often, resolve many of the issues that have been pending, and to allow people to see that this constitution is not being stretched, and that this constitution continues to be at rock bottom, our true north, at rock bottom, our ground zero when it comes to protection of rights. And so I like to end, as I started, with a quote from Senator Diokno. And again, this is from the same speech that he gave in 1986. What can we do to avoid a repetition of these atrocities? Clearly, the rule of law as we know it was not enough. Politically powerful leaders interpreted the law as they pleased, and the courts were subservient to them. That was the end of the rule of law. Inter arma silent leges. In the clash of arms, the laws are silent. Human rights lawyers and activists have tried to reverse the formula. Inter leges silent arma. Among the laws, arms are silent, but to no avail. At best, they could produce dents in the system, but not breakthroughs. Laws must find support in something outside law, just as justice can be judged only by values other than the value of justice. What did Senator Diokno mean here? He stressed, in ending his remarks here in 1986, he stressed that against a united people, no force can prevail, not even state violence. And I agree totally. But if I may add to this, if we are to continue to reverse the formula, among the laws, arms are silent, if we are to neutralize lawfare, we should insist, especially at this time, on transparency in governance, especially now. We should fully document what is happening. This may not be the right time for some legal remedies. This may not be the right court for some legal remedies, but the time will come when many of the issues that should be litigated at this time can be litigated. And so we must continue to document what is going on and what is happening. We should continue to assert all legal and meta-legal remedies that are available to us. At every turn, we should assert the Bill of Rights. At every turn, we should assert our rights guaranteed individually and collectively under international documents and international law. And we should continue to inform ourselves. If government does not want to inform us, then we should continue to inform ourselves. We should continue to tune in and not tune out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attorney Te. Lawfare is state violence in place of governance. Thank you for your meaningful insights and the points you shared with us. Attorney Dino?
Before we proceed, allow me to acknowledge some of the groups who are participating with us here in Zoom and FB Live. We have former Secretary of Educator Brother Arvin Luistro, FSC, former Congressman Erin Tanyada, former Secretary Ging Deles, Professor Socorro Reyes, and Professor Walden Bello, all members of the Free Lila Committee members. Free Lila Committee, they are all in the room. We also have Congressman Teddy Casino, Congressman Tom Villarin, or Honorable Tom Villarin, former ASEC Tanya Hamada, and other distinguished guests. Welcome, sirs and ma'ams.
Okay, so I think we proceed now to our panel of discussants. Thank you for joining again. For those who are in the FB and in the room, at this juncture, I would like to introduce the first reactor. She is the Senior Legal Advisor of the Global Access to Justice and ASEAN Program at the International Commission of Jurists, or ICJ. Prior to ICJ, she headed the Human Rights Defenders Department of Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, or Forum Asia, where she led advocacy initiatives at the regional and international levels for the implementation of standards under the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders. She served as a court attorney under Justice Adolfo S. Ascuna at the Supreme Court of the Philippines, and also as a lecturer at the University of the Philippines, Department of English and Comparative Literature. She also worked as a corporate and labor litigation attorney at the law firm from the University of the Philippines College of Law in 2000. She received her LLM in International Human Rights Law from the University of Notre Dame Law School in South Bend, Indiana in 2007, and her Bachelor of Arts degree in Comparative Literature from the University of the Philippines in 1996. Let's all welcome Attorney Emerline Hill.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you everyone for inviting the International Commission of Jurists to speak in this event. At salamat sa lecture ni Attorney Te. Attorney Te was my professor in law school, and I would have to say that he was one of the people who introduced me to human rights work, and I am actually always grateful to him for that. I fully agree with Professor Te's views, and maybe I'm just gonna build on some of his points. First, I would just like to say that we're talking about human rights during a pandemic right now. I once wrote an op-ed which was published in the Philippine Daily Inquirer about human rights during a pandemic. Tapos tiningnan ko yung mga comments online sa online version ng Inquirer. Ang daming nagsasabi, maya-maya na yung human rights, pandemic tayo ngayon, dapat stricto lahat. Kalimutan muna natin yung human rights kasi pandemic, magkakasakit tayong lahat. Tama, under international human rights law, during a public health emergency, some rights may be limited. And this is under the Syracuse principles, which I would like you to look at least, if you are interested. Some rights may be limited, but within certain parameters. And one of these rights is the freedom of expression. And Professor Te pointed out that under the law which imposed emergency measures in the Philippines, meron doong limitation on the freedom of expression by saying that a person who has been found to have been spreading false information regarding COVID-19 crisis on social media and other platforms may be imprisoned for up to 2 months or imposed a fine of not more than 1 million pesos. Indeed, freedom of expression may be limited during the time of a pandemic. Ngunit kailangan nating isipin na these limitations also have parameters. Dapat yung interpretation of the limitation should not defeat the essence of the right involved. It should be interpreted strictly in favor of the right always. And the interpretation of the right or the interpretation of the law should still be compatible under international human rights law. And in this particular case, it should be interpreted in favor of the limitations within the Syracuse principles and also within the parameters of the ICCPR. Yung ICCPR po, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, state party po yung Pilipinas doon. So dapat sundin natin yung mga parameters under the ICCPR. May nagtanong din sa akin dati, bakit ang dami-dami na ngayong ginagamit na laws to silence criticism, to silence critical views? Before, in many countries, not only in the Philippines, but in many countries all over the world, you will see that authoritarian governments would simply lock up or perhaps even kill journalists or those people who express critical views of government actions. But nowadays, we will see a wider range of laws being used to silence journalists and other ordinary people who just express criticism about what's happening in the world right now or in the country. I thought about it, and there is indeed a specific shift, a very significant shift that we are seeing. And then I thought that maybe, well, not maybe, but definitely, when these laws are being used to silence journalists and those who are critical of government action, this disguises the intimidation, harassment, and silencing of these people as legitimate action. By disguising them as legitimate action, the government is also tarnishing the credibility or undermining the integrity of these individuals or these companies in the public's eye. Halimbawa, kung yung gobyerno accuses a media company of not paying taxes, whether these allegations are true or not, this already somehow tarnishes the image of the media company in front of the public. Keeping the public's trust is the bread and butter of every journalist or media entity. They need the public's trust to keep on going. By taking it away, the government is essentially destroying the journalist or the media in a more lasting way. The damage is more long-term. So mas devious na ngayon yung movement towards silencing critics, including journalists and media. And it is definitely more exhausting and demoralizing for journalists and also human rights defenders and ordinary people if these types of harassment, intimidation, and silencing, if using the law against them, is continuous and unrelenting. I also would like to speak on what Professor Monsod said earlier about the rule of law, and this was raised several times by Professor Te, and I fully agree with how they characterize and how they define the rule of law and how it is now being undermined and it is breaking down in the Philippines. But we also have to recognize the fact that there are still segments in our society that take the weaponization of the law as rule of law. So halimbawa, marami akong naririnig ngayon na mga kasama natin, mga ordinary people na nagsasabi na yung pagbabayad ng buwis, di ba batas yun? Kung hindi sila nagbayad ng buwis, edi hindi sila sumunod ng batas. So tama lamang na parusahan sila. So sa paningin ng mga tao, yung pagparusa sa mga journalists or even other people because of the law is rule of law. Professor Monsod pointed out that is rule by law. But I think we have to emphasize na marami pa rin pagkakaintindi nila sa rule of law as rule by law. At dapat i-explain pa rin na ang rule of law ay ang batas ay tugma pa rin sa pagprotekta ng karapatang pantao. It should still be in line with the promotion and protection of human rights. So kahit na yung mga laws na nakikita natin ngayon na nasa batas, kapag hindi sila in line with the international human rights obligations of the Philippines, including the ones, the obligations under international instruments such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that particular batas, that particular law, is not in line with the rule of law. And there is a danger that the application of these laws will violate human rights and further undermine the rule of law in the country. The second point, and I'm making my intervention short because I realize that there will still be others who will be speaking after me. The second point that I would like to also emphasize, and which Professor Te raised and highlighted, are the abuses committed by law enforcement officials. Under the Syracuse principles, again, some rights may be limited within certain parameters. The right to freedom of movement is one of those rights that may be limited, however, again, within certain parameters. So there should be constant assessment of the situation by state authorities, including prompt and periodic independent review by the legislature. However, as Professor Te pointed out, the legislature, our Congress right now, many of the members in the Congress are allied with the current administration. So can we still expect an independent review of these measures by the legislature? Second, And my last point is, when we look at the implementation of the law and when we examine the abuses by state authorities or by law enforcement, which was raised by Professor Te, we should still take into consideration that these abuses must still be subject to the possibility of challenge. So, ibig sabihin, dapat pwede pa rin nating madala sa korte ang mga pang-aabuso na ito. So we also have to consider, do we still have an independent court? Professor Te pointed out we have an inscrutable court right now, and I fully agree with him right now. So we still have to, we have the task of ensuring that the system of checks and balances in our country still operate or still work. We already pointed out that we do not have any chance anymore to rely on the Congress to curb the powers of the president. So right now, we have our hope, the judiciary. And so we leave the judiciary now to look at, for instance, these 29 challenges to the anti-terror law. And the response of the judiciary there would be significant because then we would be able to tell whether our system of checks and balances is still working and whether our judiciary still would like to uphold the rule of law, which is one of its very primary tasks. That's all. Thank you.
Hey. Thank you very much, Attorney Emerlyn, for your that very insightful reaction. Our second reactor is Dr. Gideon Lasco. He is a physician and medical anthropologist. He is a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and a research fellow at Ateneo de Manila University's Development Studies Program. He obtained his medical degree from the UP College of Medicine and his PhD from the University of Amsterdam. A Palanca-winning essayist, he maintains a weekly column in the Philippine Daily Inquirer where he writes about health, lecture, and society. Dr. Lasco's current research projects include studying medical populism during times of health crisis in line with his strong advocacy on health equity and documenting the impacts of the drug war in the Philippines and Asia as one of the consultants of the International Drug Policy Consortium. He has served as an ambassador and advocate for environmental organizations like the Climate Reality Project and Forest Foundation Philippines. He is also a trustee of Center for Sustainability, an environmental nonprofit organization based in Palawan, and the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. Friends, let us all give a warm welcome to Dr. Gideon Lasco.
Public health, how many crimes are being committed in your name? COVID-19, how many abuses and atrocities are being perpetrated in the name of a campaign supposedly against you, but is in reality against the Filipino people? These questions are salient today as we grapple with a regime that has not only seen the weaponization of the law, but also the weaponization of public health to further entrench power, stifle dissent, and escape accountability. In the name of physical distancing, people have been prevented from protesting against policies that range from the abusive to the absurd. In the name of addressing the pandemic, Filipinos, indigenous organizers, school teachers, doctors, lawyers, students have been shamed, subpoenaed, apprehended, and arrested for posting critics of people in power, from barangay captains and mayors to senators and the president. In the name of quarantine, Senator Laila de Lima has been further isolated, even as her Senate colleagues are allowed to conduct sessions remotely. Meanwhile, her cases drag on, depriving her of freedom. In the cover of lockdown, repressive laws have been laid down, bent, and twisted in what Attorney Te has just explained as constituting lawfare. In the cover of lockdown, activists like Ka Randy and Sarah Alvarez have been brutally murdered, among many others. The use of a public health emergency is nothing new and nothing unique to this country. All over the world, we have seen tyrants take advantage of the pandemic by delaying elections, giving themselves emergency powers, and other measures. And not just in this pandemic. We also saw it in SARS in 2003, in the flu pandemic of 2000, in 1918. For dictators and their friends, pandemics are a blessing in disguise. In fact, as a medical doctor, I can tell you that medicine itself has its own authoritarian tendencies, which explains why some doctors warm up to the idea of dictatorship. Just as to save a patient in the OR, there's no time to consult, some doctors may think that to save a nation, there's no time for democracy either. Medicine also has a utilitarian dimension, which similarly explains why some doctors think that the ends justifies the means. If saving a life means cutting a limb, so be it. If building a nation requires cutting the jobs of 11,000 employees, so be it. If having a drug-free Philippines entails the collateral damage of tens of thousands of victims, so be it. To a certain extent, this kind of thinking is understandable. Exceptional times call for exceptional measures, and the surrender of some of our freedoms is understandable for the greater good, as Attorney Hill just stressed. Even national and international laws acknowledge this. But appeals to a greater good cannot come at the cost of violation of the dignity and the right to life of people, like Kian de los Santos, the schoolboy who, even if he were a teenager who actually used or sold drugs, did not deserve what was done to him. And just like that drug war, that fake drug war that is happening today, the pandemic responses that we're seeing is neither for the greater good nor for the lesser evil. What is happening today is indeed not a life-saving procedure, but a botched surgery by a quack doctor, a cover-up that involves trampling of rights, silencing of voices. We have given way to the ambulance, not knowing that it is rushing not to save a life, but to run away with our money. In any case, while in certain situations we need someone to make decisions on our behalf, we still need to make sure that that person is actually competent and knows what he's doing, not abusing his authority. We need a leader who can control the virus, not a president who thinks he can slap the virus and control the people. We cannot let this weaponization of both the law and public health pass. We need to unite within the common ground of freedom, the only ground from which we can advocate for our other causes and coexist despite our differences. As academics, writers, activists, and citizens, we must use our craft and our voices to point out the abuses and absurdities happening today, making them so obvious that it is impossible to deny them. And we need to document and memorialize what is happening in our time to initiate the march in the long road to accountability, to preempt historical revisionism, and I repeat, to preempt historical revisionism, because someday some people might claim that this pandemic response was a success. And finally, to encourage future generations to persist, just like we have, just like we will. In solidarity with Senator Laila de Lima and everyone who is fighting today against this lawfare, I greet you a good morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lasco. Weaponization of the public health, I think, is very, very succinct in relation to what we are doing and talking about. Thank you very much again. Our third reactor is from the youth sector. He is a former host of PTV4 and is an advocate for ending contractualization in our state network. He is the co-creator of Quarantok Media and current chairperson of the 2030 Youth Force Asia Pacific Regional Council. He is the founder and board chairman of 2030 Youth Force in the Philippines and the National Alliance of Youth Leaders Incorporated. Let us all welcome Mr. Jules Giang.
Maraming salamat po. Ako po si Jules Giang, kabilang sa 45% na nawalan ng trabaho sa gitna ng pandemya. Bahagi ng istatistika na ikinagalak ng palasyo kasi hindi naman daw 100% ang mga nawalan ng trabaho. Hindi po nagsara ang network na pinagtrabahuan ko, pero dahil hindi mapasara ang bibig at isip ko sa pagsasalita tungkol sa mga isyu ng lipunan, isinara nila ang pinto ng tinawag kong second home sa loob ng 8 taon. Required po ang lahat na magsuot ng face mask ngayon para hindi mahawa o mahawa sa COVID-19. Nakatakip man ang mga bibig natin, pero hindi mapipigilan ng face mask ang ating pagiging vocal at critical sa mga isyu ng lipunan. Naglipa na ang mga sabina sa mga nagsalita laban sa ilang politiko na bad trip ang Pangulo dahil sa isang trending na awiting palaban. Paano pa kaya kapag fully implemented na ang anti-terror law? Required na rin po ang face shield, pero hindi nito matatakpan ang mga mukha ng mga totoong tao na minsan ay tinuturing na lamang na istatistika. Sila yung nabanggit ko na 45% na nawalan ng trabaho na ikinagalak ng palasyo dahil hindi 100%. Sila yung halos 200,000 na mga Pilipinong nagka-COVID. Sila yung mga taong naging biktima ng EJ case. Sila yung 600,000 plus na kontraktual na nagtatrabaho sa ating pamahalaan. Hugas ng kamay sa loob ng 20 seconds para maiwasan ang COVID-19. Pero kapag may naisiwalat na mga kapalpakan, mas mabilis pa sa 20 seconds ang paghugas kamay ng ilang mga otoridad. For the record, kaisa ako at malamang lahat din naman ng mga kritiko ay kaisa ng mga Pilipino na mapuksa ang COVID-19. Gusto ko magtagumpay ang ating pamahalaan laban sa pandemya, pero kaakibat ng bawat pamamahala ang mga kritisismo. 8 taon po akong naniwala na kahit sino man ang nakaupo, kakayanin pong maging kabahagi ng pamahalaan bilang isa sa mga mouthpiece nito. Dahil naniniwala ako na ang pamahalaan ang may pinakamalaking tungkulin na maglingkod sa ating bayan. Pero sa nakalipas na 4 na taon, mula sa extrajudicial killings, sa tahasang pagbago ng kasaysayan bilang pambayad utang sa mga Marcos, ang pagtalaga sa posisyon sa mga personalidad na nagpapakalat ng fake news, ang pag-deny sa ABS-CBN franchise, ang red tagging sa mga aktivista, ang mga pangakong napakaw tulad ng End-Endo, ilan lamang ito sa mga nagtulak sa akin na hindi na ito ang tamang panahon para maging bahagi pa ng state media na minahal ko ng 8 taon. Ang aktivismo ay hindi terorismo. Ang aktivismo ay isang paraan ng pagmamahal natin sa ating bayan. Nagsasalita tayo dahil mayroong mali, dahil gusto nating itama ito ng pamahalaan. Bago pa man naupo si Duterte bilang Pangulo, ang ilan sa mga masugid na taga-suporta niya ngayon ang pinakamaingay laban sa pamahalaan. Pero itinuring ba silang terorista? Hindi. Itong isang lohika na tila hindi naiisip ng mga DDS ngayon. Kapag wala na sila sa poder, sila rin mismo ang maaring maabuso ng anti-terror law. Tulad ng sinabi kanina ni Atty. Te, COVID ang kalaban at hindi ang tao. Hindi disiplina ng mamamayan ang problema. Ang problema ay ang paraan ng pagtugon sa pandemyang ito. Oo, merong ginagawa ang pamahalaan, pero hindi ito ang panahon para mag-soul searching ang isang kalihim. Hindi rin droga ang kalaban ngayon. COVID po, Mr. President. Ngayon natin pinakakailangan ang best and brightest na pangako noong 2016. Ngayon natin kailangan ang malasakit, hindi lamang tapang. Hindi natin kailangan ang tapang ng Estado sa pamamagitan ng pag-mobilize ng mas marami pang pulis at sundalo para lang sumunod ang tao. Kailangan natin ang malasakit ng pamahalaan para sa mga medical frontliners, sa mga estudyante at mga guro na nanlilimos ng tig-piso para sa kanilang mga laptop, tablet at maging mga bond papers. Kailangan natin ang pag-unawa at konkretong aksyon ng pamahalaan sa bawat kritisismo na kanilang natatanggap. Mula po sa hanay ng mga kabataan, para sa mga millennials at mga Gen Z, less than 2 years na lamang po at eleksyon na. Ayon sa COMELEC, 32.9 million ang bilang ng mga young voters of 40 years old and below. 53.23% ito ng buong voting population. September na po ang simula ng voter registration. Higit pa sa pagpapatrend natin ng mga hashtags at mga memes sa Twitter man o sa Facebook, sana sapat na ang 4 years ng pamamahalang ito na tayo ay magparehistro at paingayin ang voter education. Hindi natin kailangan sabihin sa mga tao kung sino ang dapat iboto. Ang kailangan natin ay imulat sila na mayroon silang kapangyarihan na ilagay sa tamang landas ang ating bansa. We need them to realize that we deserve no less. We need to amplify the narrative that genuine governance is about serving the governed and not the governors. Mahirap man at puno ng mapanganib ang pagsasalita, lahat tayo sana ay huwag tumigil. Huwag tayong makalimot, okay lang mapagod, pero huwag natin sukuan ang Pilipinas. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Jules, no, my schoolmate and my org mate. You make us proud. At this point, we will proceed to our Q&A session. A kind reminder to our participants who will be raising their questions to please make them brief and direct to the point. And do not forget to indicate the speaker or reactor to whom your question is addressed. We will also try to pick up some questions posted in our Facebook live streaming, so feel free to post your questions up there as well. So let's start with some of the questions that we were able to lift from our different platforms. Question number 1 from Attorney Voltaire Veneracion for Attorney Te. Could members of the National Democratic Front or Makabayan Bloc be considered human rights defenders deserving of international legal protection when they support armed resistance, hence are like Nelson Mandela, not purely nonviolent resistance advocates? I ask this in relation to red tagging and inclusion of many NDF members, including the late Randy Echanis and Zara, in military's order of battle. Attorney Te?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Voltaire, for that question. Although I'm trying to divine the context of your premise. Let's start with the Constitution. Our Constitution guarantees freedom of political belief. And in fact, it immunizes people from detention or action solely on the basis of political belief. So unless, and again, speaking primarily as a lawyer, if the belief in a particular ideology itself is not a crime, then there should be no reason why they should be in an order of battle. To my understanding, the belief in armed resistance, which was part and parcel of the former subversion law, has been removed as a crime. And therefore, it falls within the range of political belief and expression that people may advocate. Of course, translating belief into action, those are two different things. Okay, so just to answer your question directly, could they be considered human rights defenders if they speak for people who believe a certain thing? Yes, because they speak for people who are speaking for rights. And so, are they deserving of international legal protection? I'm not too sure what you mean by that. But I do know that the government, for example, in relation to the peace negotiations, has in fact recognized and conferred immunities. And that by itself, under international law, is saying a lot. Okay, I know that, you've also addressed, I think, that question to M. And I see from the audience that there are Secretary Gingdeles is here, who used to work with the peace panel, so I'm sure she probably has an opinion as well. So yeah, so that would be how I would answer my question. Again, I would err on the side of protecting, promoting, and defending the right. And so, in the absence, for example, of a specific act that may be considered a crime, I would say that yes, if they speak out in favor of people who are advocating rights, then they could be considered rights defenders.
Thank you, Attorney Te. I think Attorney Emerlyn raised her hand and would like to also answer the question. You're muted, Attorney Emerlyn. Kindly unmute.
I fully agree with what Professor Tess said, and thank you, Voltaire, for raising the question, because it's an important one, and I'm sure a lot of people are asking that. In addition to what Professor Tess said, I still think that they do still deserve international legal protection. Kasi ang makikita din natin is, under international human rights law, there is what we call, and even under domestic law, there is what we call the presumption of innocence. So they do deserve the fair trial rights as well. And if they are accused of committing any crime under the revised penal code, which can be maybe murder, homicide, or whatever, they should be brought before a court and prosecuted. Their defense should be heard. And then if they are found guilty, then that can be when they would be imprisoned. So there is that international legal protection under fair trial rights, presumption of innocence, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which the Philippines is a state party.
Okay, thank you, Attorney Emerling. We now move on to our second question. The question is not addressed to anyone in particular, so maybe anyone can answer it from our speaker and our panelists. We are under a health crisis. How important is it for us to be assured that the president is fit or in good mental and physical condition to lead us in overcoming this pandemic? I wasn't the one who asked the question, but maybe the panelists can answer.
Maybe we should ask the doctor in the panel to have first crack at that question.
Hello. Can you repeat briefly the question again?
Okay. The question is, we are under a health crisis. How important is it for us to be assured that the president is fit or in good mental and physical condition to lead us in overcoming this pandemic?
Well, of course, even if the president himself is not, so there's the managerial aspect here that we need someone to really organize, because even within the health sector, people don't agree on certain matters. There's a debate on, for example, face shields, and every single policy, there are different opinions. So we really need leadership to synthesize whatever information that gets, and we need someone who can really forcefully assert that this is not a military, this should never be primarily military-led response, but a public response. And only the president can actually do that in this current situation. But at the same time, this is not just a public health crisis. This is also a socio-economic challenge for Filipinos. We need a leader who will stand there to inspire people, to make sense of people's sacrifices, that we need to endure what's happening now. So the symbolic value of a leader who's standing there and explaining to people what needs to be done cannot be underestimated. And we have seen that in other leaders enviably in other countries. And we do not see it now with our rambling late night shows that we hear. It's really a pain also to endure such lack of leadership.
Thank you, Dr. Lasco. Anyone else in the panel?
May I just add something very quick? I think
yes,
in the best of times, this is how to answer the question. In the best of times, we need someone who is decisive, who has a clear grasp of not only the issues confronting us, but a way forward. So asking questions about the health of the president is not intended to disparage the president, and that really shouldn't be the posture that he and his people should take. It is really a question that the people want. Is this question that the people are asking because they want to be assured that in the worst of times, that which currently we are facing, right, that we have that person that we need in the best of times, right? So it's really a question of asking for information, and again, I think we've been so used to presidents making all the decisions for themselves, right? And so even Dr. Lasco spoke about the managerial aspect of the presidency. And so, again, people want to know, is there anything that would prevent a president, not just this president, a president during a health crisis to be able to go through the science that's needed to be understood, the legalities that are needed to be understood, the economics that are needed to be understood, and distilling all of those, come up with a clear path forward for us. And I think that's where the question is coming from. And so I would agree, it is important for us to know it. And that is why, given what's currently happening now, more information rather than less information is needed, even on the health of the president.
Okay, thank you very much, Attorney Te. Okay, let's proceed to the next question from Ronnie Romero. It's not addressed to anyone in particular, so anyone can answer. Can you provide precautions for the legalities on SOCMED sharing, posting, and liking? I think this is a concern of a lot of people, especially after the passage of the anti-terror law. Anyone? Especially maybe the lawyers.
Well, let me just cite from Dicini versus Secretary of Justice, which is the only case so far that the Supreme Court has decided on in terms of, for example, social media, because this was a case that was decided as in relation to the Cybercrime Protection Act. And the court did say there, in relation to sharing on social media, but more particularly in case of cyber libel, that sharing something is not a crime, but writing something that is defamatory is a crime. And so, of course, that is a very limited ruling. So it remains to be seen, for example, because the Cybercrime Protection Law also criminalizes any other felony or crime that is committed with the use of an ICT. So theoretically, the felony of, let's say, inciting to sedition can be a cybercrime if it is done through an ICT device. Of course, we don't have jurisprudence on that yet. And so should that particular case arise, then probably the court will look at Dicini and say, how did we decide in Dicini? And say, do we still agree that that is the way forward? But if the court agrees that that is the way forward, then the court will probably say, if you did not write it, but you simply shared it, then you should not be liable. I mean, I'm speculating because there is really no jurisprudence on this point.
Anyone else? Attorney Emerlin.
So maybe I will just point out something. Hold on, sorry. I would just like to point out something. Under international law, Article 19 says something about freedom of expression, of course. And as I said earlier, under international law, pwedeng ilimit yung freedom of expression and freedom of expression, not opinion. Teddy Te is correct. You cannot limit the right to freedom of opinion, but you can limit freedom of expression. Pero yung limitations under freedom of expression, hindi criminalization. So there are a variety of ways of limiting freedom of expression. Maybe counter speech. So halimbawa, sasabihin nyo, fake news naman yan, so fake news is dangerous. But if the intention of fake news is to mislead, and which is usually for political or economic gain, then is the proper response to criminalize, to suppress. I think the proper response is to counter. So if you have fake news, which is actually propaganda, if you have propaganda, the best way to counter it is counter speech, not criminalize. What is allowed to be criminalized under international law is hate speech. Under Article 20, Paragraph 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that is when the speech foments or advocates national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Yun yung delikado at yun yung dapat i-criminalize, hindi ordinary speech. Some speech may be offensive to you or to me, but then it is still protected under freedom of expression and should not be criminalized.
Thank you, Attorney Emerly. Let's proceed to the next question. For Attorney Te and other panelists, the DILG recently suggested to implement a uniform policy to arrest and detain between 10 to 30 days those who allegedly violate health protocols, i.e. wearing face masks and shields. For Attorney Te and other panelists, do you consider this policy a violation against human rights?
Well, for one, if they want to make it uniform, then there should be a law. The problem with it is if it is the DILG that is proposing it, then it means that each local government will have to come up with their own separate ordinance for it, and therein lies the difficulty, because unless you dictate to the local councils that you should come up with something uniform, they might come up with different ordinances. Second, again, the question would be why, right? Why approach the non-wearing, for example, of face masks, face shields? Why approach the quote-unquote violations of the minimum health protocols as a criminal act? No? Bakit natin tinitingnan kaagad na krimen yan at ituring na krimen yan at ang tinatawag natin kaagad ay ang pulis, no? Ba't hindi natin gawin, no, na tulungan natin yun? For example, in the early days of the lockdown, I spoke in another webinar about people who violate curfew simply because they cannot get home in time because there's no public transportation and they have to work. They have to be outside, right? And so rather than arrest them, bring them to a jail which congests the jail even more, and then expose that person to the additional burden of having to pay bail to be liberated, to be freed. Why not just bring that person home, right? Why not just bring that person home, no? So ganun yung actually yung question ko dyan, eh, no? Hindi lang sa practicality, but ang tanong doon is bakit, no? Bakit, no? I think the way out there is to help people understand the need. And so that brings us back to better communication, no? And clearer information. That's where we need the science. That's where we need the clear hard data, and that's where we need the connection between the data, the science, and understanding. People have to understand the data and why we're supposed to do that. If we do that, I think more and more people will be encouraged to simply comply, no, rather than forcing them to comply. Now, for those who really cannot comply, they're too poor to even afford a face mask or face shield, no matter how cheap you make them, right? So, anong gagawin natin doon? Ituturing na lang natin silang kriminal. Dahil nga, hindi na nga nila kayang magpakain, eh. Bibili pa ng face mask, no? So, yun yung tanong ko doon, eh. So, I really don't agree with that. I don't agree with the approach, no? And so, should that happen, that I think that would be discriminatory, especially to those who really cannot afford it, because you are simply criminalizing their poverty.
Okay. Thank you very much, Attorney Te, for that. Mr. Jules Giyang, what in your opinion is the role of state media in national discourse? Should it stay along the messaging of government of the day, or should it likewise feature critical and opposing views?
Yeah, so thank you, Attorney Dino. One of my aspirations for PTV for the past 8 years, especially during this administration, because the President himself promised during the SONA that he wanted to level up the state media. In all fairness, marami rin namang improvements like the reception, our equipment, bago lahat yon. Pero there was also a promise na sinusugan din ni Secretary Martin Andanar na gawing mala BBC ang PTV4. That means na merong editorial independence. But obviously, that's very impossible, especially during this time. Because I myself observed that with the agenda setting in the news items, talagang nakaangkla yung propaganda ng pamahalaan. I mean, I understand that the state media is there to amplify the best practices or the good projects and policies of the government. Pero yung ironic kasi dito na nagagamit yung platform para i-counter yung iba't ibang mga facts na nilalabas sa iba't ibang mga mainstream media. So I'm not sure if that's still possible during this time, but the aspiration that we should pursue in the future is to really transform people's television true to its name as the television for the people. That means it should cover content both from the pros and from the anti, and it should be a platform, a safe platform for all people from all sectors to express their thoughts and their content in this state media na binabayaran ng taong bayan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jules. For the next question to Dr. Lasco, you raise a good point in preempting historical revisionism. How do you suggest we do that when local media is being intimidated to stop being too critical of government performance during the pandemic?
Well, it's really, of course, we will not deny the fact that it's really a very difficult time for any voice to be raised at the moment. Beyond these massive shutdowns of ABS-CBN, in the case of Maria Ressa, we also see it playing out in social media as well, with trolling, with hate, and so many other pressures for people. But at the same time, I think that the sheer number of people, they can only do so much. They cannot silence everyone, especially if we all do our share in making our voices known. So I think that persistence is very important at the moment. Taking advantage also of social media. I have seen some young people who are very effective in communicating by using humor, by using even TikTok videos. So we need to be creative in the same way that the people during martial law were very creative in using all these radio shows and this material underground. We need to be creative. This is the time in which we need to work, not just in terms of our knowledge, but also our creativity in articulating. So I would say that creativity and courage, at the same time, taking advantage of the tools that we have at our disposal, including social media.
We're down to maybe our last three questions because of lack of time, but there are still a lot of questions actually. To Dr. Gideon Lasco again, is it right to ease, and this is a very interesting question, is it right to ease the quarantine in Metro Manila despite increasing cases of COVID? Because this question really puzzles me. How do we find a balance with keeping everyone safe and ensuring that the economy doesn't continue to worsen?
Well, this challenge has really been faced by even the best public health practitioners around the world have struggled with this question. But what I can say is that it is a false choice. For example, these curfews, these quarantine passes, these unnecessary interactions that make the virus even more amenable to exposure. So this is a big debate between public health and the economy. But if we can break it down to small policies and demanding that they give evidence to those policies, for example, the motorcycle barrier. So I cannot answer public health economy because these are two big questions. But if we break it down into small issues that are clearly absurd, for example, this motorcycle barriers between a husband and wife who live in the same house. So if we can avoid this, so we do not add further burden, because that too is a question of that motorcycle barrier is also a public health versus economic question, because it's being invoked in the name of public health, but it's taking an economic toll on people. These face shields, are they to be required all the time, or should they be required in indoor spaces where there's stronger evidence for their use? So we need to really be micromanagers of this pandemic. And that's where our individual expertise and our voices will come in. By being very clear and demanding, okay, you say that we do this. What is the evidence for this? What is the rationale behind this? Will the curfew will the checkpoint not cause people to gather more and therefore defeat the purpose of physical distancing? let's hold them to account based on the principles that they claim to adhere to.
Completely agree with you, Dr. Lasco. It's a false choice. And we have to demand for empirical basis. Unfortunately, it's also, the next question is also for you. They're interested about what's happening in the state of our health. To Dr. Gideon, Dr. Gideon and other panelists, the POEA temporarily suspended the deployment of healthcare workers who wish to apply for jobs abroad. For you all, does this denial hinder the right of healthcare workers to choose where to work? What can you say about the DOH secretary who appealed the sense of nationalism of healthcare workers after only 25 people applied for the jobs offered by the DOH?
Well, my diagnosis of this is once again, we see the militaristic approach being applied to even the health workforce, looking at us as health professionals as if we are reservists in an army called to duty. And we do have a duty we have sworn this Hippocratic oath, and really many of our healthcare workers are dedicated and really willing to serve. However, it's the government itself that has made it difficult for many health workers to serve, because if you cannot even guarantee the provision of protective equipment, if you do not get even some hazard pay that is commensurate to the risk that you and your family is taking, how can you be persuaded to join? So we see patriotic duty. Yes, many doctors are there willing. Many interns have volunteered to stay in PGH when the pandemic first started. So there's no lack, there's no poverty of patriotism and dedication. But it is the government who should ask itself what can be done, not to stop people. So it's not again, punishment. You are not allowed to leave, but instead supporting healthcare workers so they can serve more easily transportation, accommodation, and many other concerns. They need to listen to health workers instead of imposing yet another heavy-handed rule that will only make health workers feel more emotionally encumbered by what's happening to them.
Anyone else in the panel, or that answers it? I was informed that we can still stay until 11:30, so we have 5 minutes to go, actually 6 minutes to go. So I'd like to proceed to the next question. Question number 10, from Mike Navarro of ABS-CBN. For Attorney Te, Dean Tony, and Attorney Hill, di pa rin sasalita si Dean Tony. May question na sa'yo. A group in Pampanga launched today a People's National Coalition for Revolutionary Government and Charter Change, advocating for a presidential federal parliamentary system of government until June 2022. Among the powers they want to give to the president is to strengthen regional development councils to address COVID-19, eliminate ills of society, remove unfit government officials, passage of Bayanihan Constitution, and create a commission to take possession and control of hidden wealth of PH of the Philippines. What can you say about this particular policy or this particular gathering?
Siguro mauna na ako. I actually saw that letter, and well, my first question really was, I'm a little confused about the revolutionary government that they're talking about, because they're talking about revolutionary government in relation to charter change. So that part confused me. Second, I think the timing. Well, we've spent this webinar basically unpacking some of the issues, and we're not even halfway there. Ang dami nating kailangan pag-isipan ngayon, ang kailangan natin pagtuunan ng pansin ngayon, at siguro hindi kailangan ngayon ito. Because one, we will be again taking away resources, including time, including money, including effort to talk about something that could really be addressed right now. Right now, there has already been an emergency powers law passed before, nag-expire na siya, and in that emergency powers law, maraming binigay na powers sa presidente, maraming nag-disagree dun sa powers na yun, but nonetheless ginawa yun, So I really don't see the need, personally, for this. I don't disagree per se with charter change as a principle. At the appropriate time, when the need is there for maybe for a specific provision of the Constitution to be amended, then maybe we talk about that. But again, it cannot just be simply a blanket change everything, and then hindi malinaw yung purpose. So that would be my thoughts on it. Not having seen any of the specific proposals, other than a letter asking for a meeting with, I think, the Philippine National Police Chief. And that's my third part. That's my third confusion. Why would they need to meet with the PNP chief?
Maybe Attorney Emerlyn or Dean Tony?
I'll be quick because I'll give Dean some space to speak on this. But I agree with Professor Te that perhaps pushing for charter change may not be optimal at this point. It will be spending a lot of resources that we would need for other things, which includes addressing this public health emergency. One of the things that I would like to raise, though, and this is one thing that I hope will be something that we will be reflecting and spend some introspection on, is the political patronage in our country right now. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of, we may not have some independence or a check and balance from our Congress at this point, because many of the members sitting there are allies of the government. However, if you look at it, if you look closely at the members of Congress right now, many of them used to be members of Congress also in the past administration, and they were allies of the president in that past administration. So it's really political patronage, and how it's very easy to switch sides that suit the, whatever are the political ambitions of those, and coming from the local governments. Because if you look at the members of Congress right now, they are representatives of political families in provinces, in regions. So, and it's very unfortunate that in the Philippines right now, there is less examination of the impunity and the lack of accountability that's happening in the provinces, in the local governments, because it's more dangerous to do that. If you look at many of the killings, extrajudicial killings of activists, a huge percentage of that would be about their voicing concerns or criticizing what is happening at the local government level, or corruption that is being committed at the local government level. So I think that's something to think about, how we address political patronage, instead of thinking of revising everything again as charter change.
I'll deal with it. I'll cover it during my closing remarks.
Okay, that's awesome. Okay, last two questions from Honorable Teddy Casino. Is there a way for us to stop government practice of using fake charges just to harass, vilify, intimidate, or detain political dissenters and government critics? This is what the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict is now doing.
Well, the problem there is, of course, the approach clearly is not that they intend to win the cases, right? The approach is that it is satisfied as long as they get to file the cases. So it's not a question of whether they can prove it, because by filing cases, they've already achieved the purpose. So the question is, how do you prevent it? Well, again, you can go to the court, but again, the court has shown that it has interpreted very narrowly some of the remedies that should really be available. There are stumbling blocks that are present right now. And again, I go back to Amparo. Okay, Amparo was designed by the court at the time, led by Chief Justice Ray Puno, as a catch-all remedy, as a human rights remedy, intended to, as the word amparo, to help. And so that was how it was contemplated. But of course, through the years, by cases filed and interpreted by the court, it has narrowed down. No? And I cited Zarate versus Aquino III as an instance where in the court basically, took on a case involving the order of battle and said, unless you can show me that there's a direct link between your being in the order of battle and a threat to your life, liberty, or security, then amparo will not issue. I totally disagree with that resolution. But again, that's the court speaking, and unless the court reverses that particular situation in an appropriate case, then the writ of amparo has really been weakened. So maybe one of those things that can be done is to ask for a revisit of that particular ruling by raising an appropriate case, by raising a particular case. I know that many of the groups, NUPL, for example, has been raising amparo petitions in the hope of convincing the court to roll back some of these rulings that have really not helped the writ. So maybe that's one way. Another way is to convince the authorities and the DOJ that it is unproductive to pursue charges simply for the sake of pursuing them, even if they cannot prove it. But I think that would be more difficult than convincing the court to roll back some of its decisions.
There's a plea to extend to the last 3 questions because they are very exciting questions. No? I beg the indulgence of our panelists. But just a follow-up question to the question of Congressman Teddy Casino from Professor Walden Bello, addressed to you as well, Attorney Te. How significant is the June 3 Supreme Court opinion or decision that unreasonable seizures and arrests, about unreasonable seizures and arrests and searches? Is this sign of growing independence and willingness to challenge the president?
Well, one, we must emphasize that was a decision that was done in June, okay, but it was only released in August. But I of course we know who the ponente is, Justice Ben Kagiwa, and we know how he thinks, right, on these issues, and it is significant that he got a majority in that particular decision. It's 11-3, and that by itself is significant. But the decision must be read in context. Okay, it does not generalize to all warrantless searches. It is limited to the particular facts of the situation, but it is helpful. Okay, it is helpful because it does chip away at the veneer that you can really dispense with a warrant if you want to search a moving vehicle simply on the basis of a tip, an anonymous, unconfirmed tip. And so that by itself strengthens the foundation of rights that you can assert, especially in this time. No? So I am happy that decision was promulgated by a very big majority, 11-3. But I am of course cautious about generalizing that decision to all instances. No? And maybe the third is I would be cautiously optimistic that it can indicate a sign of independence because as I said, it's 11-3, right? And written by Justice Kagiwa, of course, who is one of the few remaining non-Duterte appointees on the court. No? And so if that is an indication of how they would vote on a similar issue, no, many of the issues raised in the terror law petitions, no, deal with civil liberties, deal with how to approach civil liberties. So if that is how they could vote, possibly on a draft that would be largely in favor of civil liberties, then that is a great sign. No, but as of now, I'm wait and see, and I'm hopeful, but I'm not overly siguro optimistic. I'm just hopeful.
Thank you very much, Attorney Te. So this is a question that people were asking, but it's addressed again to you, Dr. Lasco. As a medical practitioner, do you believe in the authenticity of the DOH data, especially in hospital capacity to deal with COVID cases? Maybe an interesting follow-up question to that is, do you believe the data insofar as the recovery of people is concerned? Dr. Nasco?
Well, of course, even though we know that health now is highly politicized, I can say that what's problematic, what I can commit to is to say that what's been problematic is the way the data has been presented and haphazardly. There's no consistency. So these questions are really understandable, not so much because of the substantive questions about the data, but the way it's been presented, how it's changed over time, even the timing. It used to be 4 p.m. and then suddenly 8 p.m. and then there was a few days that there was no release of data. So all of these really erode the trust on people on DOH, and this is really, so we really need transparency with this data. So these questions must be taken seriously because they erode the trust of people on DOH. And we need very badly now for people to trust DOH, because I worry that when a vaccine comes, and we're all hoping for a vaccine, but it will also rely on people's trust. Let's not forget the lessons of the dengue vaccine scandal, in which it's caused so many people to lose trust on immunization. So the trust on DOH actually is something that we want to happen, for people to trust government as an idea, as a source of public health information and public health planning. But if they don't address the questions, regardless of the substantive questions, and we do have experts, independent epidemiologists who are data scientists who are also doing some kind of fact checking, and we welcome them. We need to support these people, because these issues of trust will have consequences not just for our politics but also for our public health.
Last two questions. Final na yun, na last two questions. To all panelists, from Honorable Tom Villarin, there is a disturbing trend for the Philippines to renounce adherence to international law, like our withdrawal from ICC, reimposition of death penalty, and now public health emergencies using punitive measures. HRC report to OHCHR are recommendatory, not mandatory, including UPR mechanism. Are international human rights instruments still enforceable under a lawfare regime?
Yeah, my answer there is short. No, I think we would not have imagined that there would be an administration that could even contemplate withdrawing unilaterally from an international obligation that we contracted, such as for the ICC. Especially after working so hard to get the Rome Statute in place, right? But it has happened, and so in terms of whether it is still enforceable, I think in the realm of the possibilities, in the realm of possibilities, posible na ngayon yun kasi nakita na natin yun na ginawa na no. So but I'm hoping it won't happen, but again with the possibilities that are being pushed by this government, mukhang posible nilang gawin uli yun kasi nagawa na nila sa ICC. Again, ang susi doon, a court that will say no. If the court says no, you can't just do that. You can't just unilaterally withdraw. You need, for example, the Senate approval, for example, and then that would put some form of checks or balances on that. Maybe M, of course, can say more about.
Thank you, Professor Te. I agree with you again, and of course, these actions by the Philippine government makes it an outlier in the international community. And it's not doing itself any favors. I've actually been observing and firsthand watching how the Philippine representatives to the Human Rights Council act, and it's quite disconcerting. And quite frankly, as a Filipino citizen, it was very embarrassing to watch how our representatives comport themselves and speak during these international events. They seem to be distancing themselves from the obligations that they have contracted under international law. But one thing I can say for sure is that they are able to do this because there is also, they can. And they can because there is a lack of understanding in the public about the importance of human rights and international law. So halimbawa, nung sinabi ni Duterte, hindi naman natin kailangan yung ICC that's imposed by the West on us. Yung publiko, umuo naman. Maraming nagsasabi na, ay, oo, okay lang yun. Bakit? Yung mga puti lang naman yung nagsasabi niyan sa atin eh. Nakakalimutan natin na the Philippines, especially a very renowned Filipino, led the way in putting together the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and that's Carlos P. Romulo. So human rights, international human rights law is not a Western imposition. We asked for that. In fact, we have to remember na yung UDHR, it was Carlos P. Romulo who actually rallied all the other newly decolonized states, including those from Africa, to insist na yung non-discrimination provision under the UDHR be included. Kasi sabi niya, dapat lahat ng mga provisions in human rights under this UDHR should apply to us as well. Bakit niya sinabi ito? Dahil sa ating history na naging colony tayo ng Spain at saka ng Amerika, na we became second-class citizens in our own country. So this is why he is saying there should be non-discrimination under international human rights law in this international human rights instrument. So we should be proud of that as Filipinos, but then the way it is being spun right now by the government, that international law and these international human rights mechanisms are being imposed on us, and we do not need them. But definitely we need them. In fact, we ask for them.
Thank you very much, Emerlyn. Our last question for today's forum is from Professor Soc Reyes. The question is, going back to the case of Senator Laila as a victim of the weaponization of law, what do you think is the future of her case?
Siguro ako na mauna. Well, unfortunately, the trial is ongoing. For some reason, it has taken a lot of time, and well, particularly because there was, I think, a series of inhibitions that happened, which basically delayed as well the processes. No? What is the future of the case? Short of the government desisting, meaning saying, well, there really is no case. Unfortunately, it will have to wind up to its logical conclusion, meaning the end of trial and a judgment. And so, I will not comment on the merits. I'm pretty sure that her lawyers are handling it very, very well and very, very competently. But unfortunately, that is how it will now have to proceed. The way I think that the advocates can help, is really to push for fundamental guarantees on her part as an accused and as a detainee, and not just for her, but for everyone in the same situation, to be enjoyed. There are certain rights that she enjoys as an accused and as a detainee that need to be emphasized. And for me, looking at it from as an outsider to the case, I see that there are certain things that are not being observed, and I think that should be insisted upon.
There's just a final question. How important is it for everyone to continue being vocal against the abuse of power and controversial policies, despite various threats on dissents, criticisms, and constitutional stretch, as have been discussed by panelists earlier? That's the last question before we proceed to our closing remarks.
I think yes. This webinar, if this webinar is any indication, I think we should continue to speak out. Of course, threats will always be there. We just need to be a little bit more, maybe, to take precautions. Not to be stifled, not to be cowed, but to be a little bit more careful in how we express ourselves. But of course, that shouldn't be a reason to say that we should stop speaking, that we should stop asking, that we should stop questioning, and that we should stop confronting.
Thanks for that question. And I agree with Professor Tag that all the more, it is very important for us to speak now. But it's not only about speaking, it's also about listening. So there may be people who may think differently from us. There may be people who have other opinions or other ways of expressing their feelings about the situation. I think it's important for us to listen to them as well, because they are our fellow Filipinos and they have different experiences from us. But one thing for sure is that we should not shut up each other. There should be a dialogue, and this should be a culture of dialogue, a culture of debate should be appreciated in our country. And there should be no shutting down of each other.
Okay. Secretary Dicky, who's our next closing remark. Thank you very much to all our panelists and our speaker for today for that very insightful discussion. Secretary Dinky?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much to all the questions. My takeaways: transparency, accountability, persistence. And if I may add my 2 cents, poverty is a comorbidity in this pandemic. And we should not forget that there are millions of people who are going hungry. And by the way, a revolutionary government is outside of the Constitution, something to reflect about. Yes, so to formally close our webinar, we have Dean Tony Lavinia, a social entrepreneur and an environmental and human rights advocate. He is the former Dean of the Ateneo School of Government and a law professor in several universities across the country. As an environmental policy expert, he is the lead negotiator for the Philippines in the climate change negotiation and is currently a member of the board of directors of several national and international organizations such as the Manila Observatory Center, Center for International Forestry Research, Southeast Asia Regional Initiatives for Community Empowerment, or CRISE, Southeast Asia Regional Initiative, and Center for International Environmental Law. Let's all welcome one of the founding members of the Committee for the Freedom of Senator Laila de Lima, Professor Attorney Antonio Tony Lavinia.
Thank you for that, Dinky. Thank you for all the panelists, particularly Attorney Teddy Te. Thank you to Dr. Monsod for opening. The panelists, of course, were awesome. Gideon, Lasco, Attorney M, Jules was very, very good. The questions as well. I actually noticed a very important question by Carol Arroyo that was not answered, and it's okay because I'll actually answer that in the context of why the Free Laila Committee actually convened this webinar. The reason why we did this, from our point of view, we want to, of course, highlight again the situation of Attorney Laila, of Senator Laila. It's her birthday next week that we celebrate. She's filed 2 bail petitions now in 2 of her cases that's pending. So we would like to highlight that. But we've realized that she's there, but she's not the only one. And it's really very important for us to emphasize that what we're facing is a double pandemic, a coronavirus pandemic, and a pandemic of authoritarianism. And red tagging is a form of doing that. That's directed to people that are dissenters, regardless of political beliefs. And that's why it's important for everyone. I mean, I always say this in all my talks, in all my classes. I mean, it's important to get together to be united. I will not go and summarize the discussion because it's very rich and it went to a lot of places. I learned a lot. I wish I haven't met my constitutional law and political law classes yet all over the Philippines. Next week pa sila mag-start. I would have required it. But I have a law and pandemic class with a lot of judges that are in the class in San Beda and environmental law classes. And certainly I recommended this for them to attend because there was lots to learn. But what I would like to end with now is what we saw is a snapshot. I mean, this is a snapshot for us. And we always realize that in a country like ours, the snapshot changes quickly. right? The Supreme Court, it's a snapshot. Justice Ben's decision, what a wonderful decision. Let's not. I would you know, it's gonna be the lead case, right, for my constitutional law 2 case course in BGC, in UP BGC, which meets in a couple of weeks. Right? It's gonna be the first case because it just tells you that okay, this is not a fluke, right? I mean, we know the thinking of Justice Kagiwa. What is surprising is that it was accepted. Of course, there's the anti-terror law petition. That's actually the virtual background when we filed for Lumad and Moros and Cordilleran's a petition. That's really where you can see. There's the Tokhang case that Flag filed that's still really pending, right? And those are, for me, those are the big cases where we can see whether the Supreme Court can be relied upon. But to end, I would also give a big picture also of linking the state that we are in today with what we celebrated yesterday, which was the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. I mean, and link that as well to the killings of Randy Chanis and Sara Alvarez. By the way, Ted, Sara Alvarez is a good example of the failure of Amparo, because Sara had filed with others as a human rights defender an Amparo case, which was dismissed by the Court of Appeals, right? So that's a really good example of the failure of Amparo to protect our human rights defenders. But I would say, and if you indulge me, I will end by actually reading my part of my column today. It's called The Rains of August. It's an interesting column because I was actually asked by an author writing about the Aquino assassination and what happened after, if I could recall and write about details about the funeral march, which many of us, the older ones, sorry Jules, the millennial, you were there, you were baby still at the time, but she asked me if I could actually write about it, so she could also use it in historical book as a first person witness. And I think I'll share that account for a couple of minutes because I think it says something about what we need today. It starts about the assassination, the days after, and then suddenly the going to Tarlac, bringing the body of Ninoy to Tarlac, and then thousands and millions of people already from Tarlac back to Santo Domingo Church was already following the hearse, and then of course the funeral march. And I'll share with you my article on that, the words I describe about that. I joined the funeral march walking with Dr. Leovino Garcia, my mentor and chairman of the philosophy department of the Ateneo de Manila, after attending the funeral mass at 9 a.m. officiated by the late Cardinal Jaime Sin. We walked from Santo Domingo to Rojas Boulevard for 8 hours as the funeral hearse slowly wound its way to España, Quiapo, where the crowds were the thickest, and Luneta. It was people from all walks of life, poor and rich, men, women, and children, more than 2 million of them. It would go on for another 3 hours, arriving only at 9 p.m. in Manila Memorial Park in Parañaque. When we got, it felt midway to Luneta from Santo Domingo, it rained hard. Leo and I were soaked, wet from shoes up. But this did not make us run for cover, nor did it scare or drive people away. The harder it rained, the bigger the multitudes grow. It felt like the rain was sent by God, who cried with us as we mourned the death of a hero. People were singing in the rain, Bayan Ko, and other hymns of struggle. We were all chanting, Tama na, Sobra na, Palitan na. We shouted to Ninoy and his family and to each other, Hindi ka nag-aisa. When we got to Rojas Boulevard, the rain stopped, and I imagined seeing a rainbow, or could it have been the colors of the majestic Manila Bay sunset? That was a good omen, I thought. Before the Aquino assassination, the resistance movement against the dictatorship was already growing. Aquino's murder accelerated that process, and the funeral saw organized and emergent groups come out of the shadows to join millions more who were unaffiliated, demanding justice for Aquino, justice for all. Embedded in an iconic streamer with images of Ninoy, Edgar Hobson, Makling Dulag, Juan Escandor, and Bobby de la Paz. that transformed the Aquino assassination as not about one man, but about the many who were killed and tortured by the dictatorship. Cory and the Aquino family personified a country oppressed, and the dignity and courage they displayed became a mirror of what we could do with courage, faith, and unity. We need this again today, courage, faith, and unity, as darkness covers the land, because the coronavirus pandemic is coinciding with a terrible authoritarianism, both virulent diseases which kills. August is a sad month for the nation. Cory also died during this month on August 1, 2009. On August 27, Senator Lila de Lima would have spent her 4th birthday unjustly detained. These past days, two great Filipinos, human rights and peace workers, Randy Chanis and Zara Alvarez, were killed by evil men who want the country and its poor permanently oppressed. I echo Vice President Leni Robredo's words about the significance of August 21. In the noise that we began to realize how we're all bound together, even more tightly during times of oppression, suffering, and crisis. In this realization, we found solidarity. We found the strength to take the first step towards a freer, fairer, more humane society. We found hope and the courage to take our lives on that hope, just as he did. And today, I hope we also find that solidarity, that hope, and that courage. I welcome the rains of August. I pray that it wash away the evil in the hearts of men, comfort and heal the grieving and suffering, and make this nation kind and happy. The rainbow of liberation always follows the rain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, Attorney Lavinia. Courage, faith, unity, hope. A rainbow, I think, is a good way to remember this, especially in the birthday of Senator Lila, that there will be soon a rainbow in her life. So at this point, I would like to thank all our speakers and reactors and everyone who joined us, both at the Facebook Live, in the webinar. I think this has been a very fruitful and very insightful discussion. Thank you for taking your time for this morning and sharing your thoughts, experiences, and insights, not just the panel of reactors, not just Attorney Teb, but all the questions that came in. I think we draw strength from one another in these times.